August 29th, 1943, the 38th day. The air inside the steel hull of the heavy Tiger tank, tactical number 217, had long ceased to be just air. It had become a thick, oily emulsion of sweat, fear, the faint smell of decay, and metallic dust. It was heavy, like the wet, sludgy earth that held their machine captive, and each breath was a struggle, as if the lungs were trying to process not oxygen, but the very essence of despair. 4 men, once an elite crew, the pride of the Panzerwaffe, now resembled ghosts, faded daguerreotypes of their former selves. Their faces, caked in a mixture of soot and grime, were stretched taut over their skulls, and a sick, feverish glint burned in their deep-set eyes. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, the commander, sat in his seat, clutching the turret controls as if he feared he would crumble to dust if he let go. His eyes were fixed on the shattered triplex viewport. A dark spiderweb of cracks radiated from a small round hole, the last greeting they had received from the outside world many nights ago. He was no longer looking out. He was looking inward, counting the remnants of his discipline and will, like a miser counting his last coins. Beside him, hunched over his gun sight, sat Kurt Vogel, the gunner. His hands rested on the traverse mechanisms, his fingernails broken, the knuckles scraped raw. He hadn't slept for 3 days. His body twitched with fine tremors and his lips silently whispered curses. He hated everyone. The commander for his steely, inhuman will, the mechanic for his useless genius, the loader for his dull animal patience. But most of all, he hated this iron box that had become their shared sarcophagus. Down below in the driver's compartment, driver-mechanic Helmut Weiss, a quiet genius whom everyone considered an eccentric, was tending to his latest invention. He had built it from parts of the broken radio, a copper tube from the lubrication system, and a piece of canvas. It was a primitive filter, a distiller, their only hope for another sip of water. Drop by drop, a murky, chemical-smelling fluid trickled into a dented tin can. This was their life. The taste of life was foul. The 4th loader, Friedrich Baumann, nicknamed Fritz, an old veteran of the First Great War, sat on the floor, his back against the ammunition rack. He was as still as a granite slab. His eyes were closed, but he wasn't asleep. He was simply conserving energy, breath, life. He had seen death in forms these boys could never dream of, but even he could not have imagined one like this, slow, lingering, humiliating. The 5th was no longer with them. His body, wrapped in a greatcoat, lay in the rear of the tank, where the mighty Maybach engine once roared. Now, only silence and stench occupied that space. Richter raised a hand, giving a signal. Helmut stopped his work and froze. In the ensuing silence, a sound penetrated the thick armor. Faint, thin, almost unreal. A squeak. Vogel snapped his head up, his eyes flashing madly. Baumann opened his eyes. In that sound was everything. Hope, salvation, food. A mouse. A small field mouse had found its way into their dying world. 4 men transformed into a pack of predators. Their movements became fluid, silent, primal. They froze, listening, trying to pinpoint its location. And these were the same men who, a month ago, had laughed at jokes, smoked cigarettes, and considered themselves masters of the world, invulnerable gods in a shell of steel. How had they come to this? How had Aryans, supermen, the elite of the nation, turned into cavemen hunting mice in their own grave? To understand how the crew of the most advanced tank of its time became a primitive tribe living at the bottom of a muddy ravine, we must go back 38 endless days, to that hot July day when their world, so simple and clear, collapsed forever. July 12th, 1943. The field of Prokhorovka. The air shimmered and melted, not so much from the summer heat, as from the roar of hundreds of engines and the clang of thousands of tank treads. The earth groaned, boomed, and shuddered under artillery strikes, turning into a black, pock-marked desert of wounds. This was the climax of Operation Citadel, the greatest tank battle in human history. And at its very heart, at the spearhead of the Grossdeutschland Division's steel wedge, was he. Heavy Tank Tiger, number 217. For its crew, this was not hell, but their element. They were born for this day. The commander, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, a 32-year-old Prussian with thin lips and cold gray eyes, guided the machine with the confidence of a surgeon performing a routine operation. Every word he spoke over the intercom was precise, every movement calculated. He did not tolerate haste, did not recognize panic, and despised weakness. His tank was a perfect mechanism, and he demanded the same perfection from his crew. The gunner, Kurt Vogel, a 27-year-old Bavarian, was his complete opposite. Loud, fond of crude jokes and strong beer, In battle, he became a possessed artist. His hand merged with the traverse wheels, and his eye, pressed to the rubber eye cup of the Zeiss sight, saw the battlefield as if it were in the palm of his hand. Target! TT-34. 1,100 meters. Armor piercing! His voice boomed in the headphones, drowning out the engine's roar. Down below at the controls sat Helmut Weiss, 22 years old, a silent, withdrawn youth from Dresden, a watchmaker's son. He didn't like war, but he adored machines. To him, the 60-ton beast was a living organism, capricious but obedient if you knew its language. He felt every jolt, every grind, every fluctuation in the performance of the 700-horsepower Maybach. Loader Fritz Baumann, 45, was their silent guardian angel. He had been through the trenches of Verdun, had seen the first tanks, and now, with muscular, calloused hands, he sent 20-kilogram shells into the breech of the 88mm cannon with the ease of a magician. He rarely spoke, but his calm presence had a soothing effect on the others. And finally, radio operator and machine gunner Emil Schultz, 19 years old, a freckled boy from Hamburg, a schoolboy yesterday, for whom this was the first real battle. Excitement and terror washed over his eyes in equal measure. He fired his machine gun at the scattering infantry and tried to break through the static to headquarters, reporting on their triumph. They were a single entity, a death machine sweeping away everything in its path. Target destroyed, Vogel would shout triumphantly as another Soviet tank turned into a fireball. Forward, Richter commanded coldly. They had already claimed 4 T-34S and 1 self-propelled gun. Their armor withstood direct hits, and their cannon punched through enemy machines from a kilometer away. The feeling of invincibility was intoxicating. It seemed nothing in this world could stop them. They forged ahead, pulling away from the main force, breaking through the defenses, driving deep. In the heat of battle, Richter didn't notice they had drifted into a low-lying area, towards a wide, overgrown ravine. Recon had reported it was passable, but after a night of rain, its bottom had turned into a viscous, treacherous mire. And then came the jolt. Not from an enemy shell. Something completely different. A dull, powerful impact that made the entire 60-ton machine shudder and nosedive. Then came the sound that every tanker dreads. A high-pitched, ear-splitting screech of overstressed metal, followed by a dull crack. "What the hell, Helmut?" Richter roared. "The engine, Herr Oberleutnant," came Weiss's breaking voice from below. "Oil pressures dropped to 0. "Something with the reduction gear! We're dead!" The mighty Maybach gave a final, deathly rattle and fell silent. And in that sudden, deafening quiet, broken only by the distant rumble of battle, they heard another, even more terrible sound. A squelching, sucking noise. Their tiger, their indestructible fortress, was slowly, centimeter by centimeter, sinking into the thick, black mud. That evening, as Emil tried for the 100th time to raise headquarters, he didn't yet know that the antenna had been sheared off by shrapnel half an hour ago, and that his desperate calls were fading into the void. He didn't yet know that the main forces, having met stiff resistance, had changed their direction of attack, leaving them in a newly formed pocket in no man's land. That evening they were still joking about spending the night in the safest hotel on the Eastern Front, never suspecting that this hotel would become their prison, and that their stay would stretch into an eternity. Impact. A screech. Darkness. The first few moments after the engine died felt like being stunned. The crew, accustomed to the constant roar of the motor, the vibration and the clamor, suddenly found themselves in a ringing, unnatural silence. Only the distant, muffled explosions reminded them that the war was continuing somewhere. But for them, for Tank 217, it had been put on pause. "Report status." Richter's voice, sharp as the click of a bolt, shattered the stupor. "Engine is unresponsive," Helmut Weiss reported from below, his voice tense but calm. Judging by the sound, the main clutch shaft sheared off, or something in the reduction gear. Can't say without an inspection. "We're sitting in mud up to the skirts. The tracks are sunk. We can't get out on our own." "Communications," Richter snapped into the void. "Silent, Herr Oberleutnant," answered Emil Schultz, his voice trembling with anxiety. "Complete radio silence. I think the antenna is damaged." Richter slowly, almost reluctantly, pressed his face to the commander's periscope. The picture it revealed was bleak. Their tiger was tilted to the right, in the very center of a wide, marshy ravine. Steep, eroded slopes lay ahead and behind. To the left and right, a swampy, squelching mire dotted with sparse bushes, a perfect hiding spot, and a perfect trap. From the air, Neither their own forces nor the enemy could see them. They had simply vanished. "Well, Captain, have we run aground?" Kurt Vogel threw out venomously, pulling away from his sight. His voice held not so much concern as malice. He had always disliked Richter for his arrogance and Prussian stiffness. "Silence, Vogel!" The commander cut him off. "Panic is a luxury we cannot afford. We are the crew of a heavy tank. They will look for us. A repair crew will arrive with the first light of dawn. Our job is to wait." He spoke with confidence, enunciating every word. He believed it himself. He had to. The system couldn't fail. The Wehrmacht doesn't abandon its own, especially not elite crews in brand new machines. The night passed in anxious waiting. They sat in complete darkness, conserving the batteries, listening to the sounds from outside. Somewhere in the distance, artillery boomed and occasionally, flare rockets streaked across the sky, their deathly light momentarily piercing the vision slits, illuminating the tense faces in the gloom. In the morning, nothing had changed. The sun rose and the steel box began to heat up rapidly, turning into a stuffy, scorching oven. The air grew heavy and humid. They finished the last of their dry rations and took a few sips of warm water from their canteens. Richter established the strict routine. Observation in shifts, complete silence, conservation of everything. He understood that in this confined space, discipline was the only thing that could save them from madness. By noon on the second day, Vogel couldn't take it anymore. "I can't do this anymore," he exploded. "We're going to be cooked alive in here. No one is coming for us. The front has moved on." "We've been abandoned." I said silence. Richter's voice was quiet, but it carried such a chilling threat that even Vogel choked. "They've written us off, don't you see? Written us off," Kurt persisted. "We have to get out, at night, one by one." "We can break through to our lines." "Break through to where, you idiot?" Richter slowly turned his head toward him. "This is no man's land. Snipers, minefields. They'll pick us off within 100 meters, about 330 feet. Here, inside the armor, we are safe. Our armor is our fortress. Any attempt to leave the tank without an order will be treated as desertion and punished according to martial law. Do you understand me?" There was something in his gray eyes that made Vogel back down. This was more than a commander's order. It was the will of a man who had already made a decision. He was not going to surrender, not going to run. He was going to wait. And he would force the others to wait with him. At that moment, he looked at his terrified, exhausted men, then at the massive control levers hopelessly jammed in the mud. And in that moment, he understood. If they were to survive, he had to be more than just their commander. He had to become their jailer and their god. The third day turned into the fourth into the fifth. Time lost its familiar shape and stretched into an endless, viscous torture, consisting of two states: agonizing heat during the day and a damp, bone-chilling cold at night. The Tiger's steel box would heat up under the July sun until the armor was impossible to touch. The air inside became heavy, thickened, saturated with the smell of sweat, hot metal, and oil. They sat in their trousers, yet sweat streamed down their bodies, dehydrating them, draining the last of their strength. At night, however, when the earth cooled, the dampness from the marshy ground seeped inside, and the cold chilled them to the bone. They wrapped themselves in their tunics and tried to stay warm, huddling together, forgetting their feuds and dislikes. But the most terrible enemy was not the heat or the cold. It was thirst. The water in their canteens ran out on the third day. Richter divided the last drops equally, measuring them out with a canteen cap. It was no longer water, but a warm, metallic-tasting liquid, yet each sip felt like a gift from heaven. When it was gone, the real hell began. Their lips cracked, their tongues swelled until they barely fit in their mouths. Speaking became more and more difficult. Thoughts became tangled, turning into a viscous, sticky mass that contained only one word: drink. Emil Schultz, the youngest, began to hallucinate. He called for his mother, begged her for milk, and wept. Fritz Baumann, the old soldier, wiped his forehead with a cloth damp with condensation, but it did little to help. They tried to collect the condensation that formed on the inner surface of the armor in the mornings, but there was pitifully little of it. A few dirty drops, not even enough to moisten their lips. Kurt Vogel, broken and apathetic after his confrontation with Richter, lay on his seat, staring at a single point. He seemed to have given up. On the night of the fifth day, it began to rain. Not a downpour, but a fine, drizzling mist. The sound of the drops drumming on the tank's roof was sweeter music to them than any symphony. Richter gave the order. They opened the loader's hatch just a few centimeters, just enough to slide a cooking pot under the stream of water. It was a colossal risk. Any stray shell, any observer could spot them. but thirst was stronger than fear. They took turns at the hatch, collecting the precious drops. In an hour, they managed to fill the pot with murky, dirty water that tasted of rust and leaves. They drank it in small sips, straining it through a handkerchief. And it was bliss. They had conquered thirst, but with water came hunger. The dry rations were long gone. Chocolate, hardtack, canned goods, all that remained in another distant life. Now their stomachs cramped with agonizing spasms. They ate everything they could. The leather straps from their map cases, which they boiled in the pot to soften them, the paper from manuals, even the tobacco from their cigarettes. But it didn't satisfy. It only fueled their hunger. One day, Fritz noticed a thin root of some plant pushing through a crack in the floor where the control rods ran. He studied it for a long time, sniffed it, chewed it. Having grown up in a village, he knew a lot about plants. "We can eat this," he rasped. "It tastes foul, but it won't poison us." They dug up the mud beneath their feet and began to greedily devour the dirty, fibrous roots. And then, the words that changed everything were spoken. They came from Helmut Weiss, who until then had been mostly silent, tinkering with the innards of the damaged engine. "Water," he whispered. "We have water." Everyone stared at him. "Are you out of your mind, Helmut?" Vogel snarled. "What water?" "In the cooling system," Weiss continued just as quietly. "It's a mixture of water and glycol. Poison, but if we distill it, if we separate the water from the impurities." He fell silent, as if frightened by his own thought. Distill, here, under these conditions. It sounded like madness. It seemed all was lost. But it was then that the quiet driver-mechanic spoke the words that were both salvation and insanity. "Herr Oberleutnant, we have a radio." Helmut Weiss's idea at first seemed to the others like the ravings of a man delirious and dying of thirst. Distill poisonous coolant fluid in a tank in the middle of enemy territory without proper equipment or tools. It wasn't just bold, it was absurd. But in Klaus Richter's mind, which was clinging to life, this mad idea took root. He stared at Weiss for a long time, into his feverishly bright eyes, and he saw there not madness, but the cold, desperate calculation of a genius. "Explain," Richter said curtly, and Helmut began to speak. He spoke quietly, with pauses, choosing his words. But there was no doubt in his speech. It was as if he were reading an invisible blueprint already drawn in his head. "The principle of distillation is simple. Water and ethylene glycol have different boiling points. You need to heat the mixture, evaporate the water, and then cool the steam, turning it back into a liquid, but this time a pure one, free of poisonous impurities. The problem was how to do it here and now. They couldn't start a fire. The smoke would instantly give away their position." And then Weiss pointed to the broken radio. "The batteries are still alive," he explained. "If we take the tungsten filament from a vacuum tube in the transmitter, we can make a heating element, like in an immersion heater. There's enough current to bring a small amount of liquid to a boil." "All right," Richter nodded, already infected by his confidence. "We heat it, then what?" "Where do we get a condenser, genius?" Helmut pointed to a copper tube running from the oil tank. "A coil. If we run the steam through it and cool the tube itself." "Cool it with what, Weiss?" "Our last drops of water are worth their weight in gold." Vogel couldn't hold back. "With the earth," Helmut answered calmly. "With the mud. It's cold down below. We'll dig a small pit in the floor, lay the tube in it, and cover it with damp earth." The plan was audacious, almost fantastical, but it had its own twisted logic. It was a triumph of human intellect over desperate circumstances. They were turning the elements of their prison into tools of salvation. The radio, which could no longer connect them to the world, would give them fire. The lubrication system, which could not make the dead engine work, would become the heart of their apparatus. And the mud, which held them captive, would give them cold. Richter gave the order. The work began. Helmut Weiss, usually quiet and inconspicuous, was transformed. He became the center of their small universe. He gave short, clear instructions, and even Vogel, grumbling, obeyed him. They dismantled the radio, carefully extracting the necessary parts. Fritz Baumann, with his strong hands, bent the copper tube into the shape of a coil. Richter himself used a bayonet to chip away at the damp, compressed mud in a corner of the fighting compartment. After several hours of hellish labor, their creation was ready. It was a cumbersome, ugly contraption, assembled from debris and junk, but its design showed a brilliant mind at work. Weiss drained a few liters of the greenish, oily liquid from the radiator into a cooking pot. He placed it on an improvised stand, lowered the heating element into it, and connected it to the battery terminals. Then he covered the pot with a lid that had a hole in it, to which he attached one end of the copper coil. The other end of the tube he placed into an empty tin can. Everyone froze, holding their breath. Helmut closed the circuit. A faint hiss was heard. The liquid in the pot began to heat up. The minutes dragged on like hours. Finally, a thin, barely visible wisp of steam emerged from the free end of the tube, and then the first drop fell. Clear, pure, followed by a second, a third. They watched this process as if it were a miracle. This was their first victory. A victory not over the enemy, but over fate itself. They weren't just waiting for rescue. They had begun to save themselves. When about 100 grams of liquid had collected in the can, Helmut disconnected the power. He sniffed the water. It had almost no smell. He dipped a finger in it and licked it. Then he took a small sip. Everyone watched him, not breathing. He stood for a few seconds, listening to his body. "Water," he said succinctly. They had won. But at that moment, as they passed the precious can to one another, each taking a life-saving sip, they did not yet know that their creation, their source of life, would also bring with it a new, even more terrifying threat. For the faint scent of warm steam and human breath, escaping through the ventilation louvers, had attracted the attention of the ravine's other inhabitants, those who were very, very hungry. The first victory breathed new life into the dying crew. The presence of an almost inexhaustible source of water, albeit with a foul chemical aftertaste, changed everything. Despair was replaced by a grim, focused determination. They would survive. Not through some miraculous rescue, but in spite of everything, through their own will and intellect. Realizing this, Klaus Richter understood that his role as commander had changed. He had to do more than just maintain discipline. He had to build an entire new world, a small state within a steel shell, with its own laws, economy, and routine. And so he began to build his empire of nothing. The first law of his new state was the law of water. Helmut Weiss was appointed the high priest of their water deity, the distiller. Only he had the right to operate and maintain the apparatus. The process of distillation became a ritual. It was performed twice a day, early in the morning and late in the evening when the outside temperature was at its lowest, so the coil would cool more effectively. Water production was strictly limited to avoid draining the batteries prematurely. Each man received 300 milliliters per day. Richter personally measured each portion, and no one was allowed a single extra sip. The second law was the law of time. In a confined space where day blended into night, it was easy to lose track of the days and go mad. Richter ordered Fritz Baumann to keep a calendar. The old soldier scratched the date onto the armor with his bayonet. Each new mark was both a tally of their suffering and a symbol of their resilience. Another day survived. The day was divided into clear periods: sleep, wakefulness, watch duty at the periscopes, distiller maintenance, and foraging. Yes, foraging for food became the third vital part of their existence. They became hunters. Their prey was anything that moved or grew in their steel world. They learned to catch the mice that sometimes scurried inside. For this, they used primitive traps made of wire and crumbs of hardtack they managed to scrape from the crevices. Each captured mouse was a cause for celebration. It was divided among the four of them, roasted on a piece of metal heated with a blowtorch. They ate beetles, larvae, and earthworms, which they dug out of the mud under their feet. Fritz, their keeper of wisdom, taught them to distinguish between edible and inedible roots. Their empire even acquired its own territory, clearly divided into zones. The commander's turret was the headquarters, the driver's station was the laboratory and kitchen, and the rear compartment, where Emil's body lay, became a forbidden zone, the tomb. They never spoke of him, but his silent presence was a constant reminder of the price of survival. Richter, as the ruler of this grim empire, was cruel and just. He established a dictatorship, but it was a dictatorship in the name of life. He suppressed any talk that sowed panic, any dispute that could escalate into conflict. He understood that their main enemy was not hunger or thirst, but the madness that was already clawing at their souls. He forced them to work so they would have no time for self-destruction. He made them clean weapons they couldn't use, check instruments that were useless, and tidy their dwelling. This system, this routine, this harsh but understandable order created from chaos, gave them more than just a chance at physical survival. It gave them a psychological anchor, a reason to exist. They were not just victims trapped in a tomb. They were colonists on an uninhabited planet building their new world, and for a few days it worked. They almost believed they could live like this forever. Their life fell into a grim but predictable rhythm, but not everyone was prepared to live by the laws of the new world. Kurt Vogel, whose rebellious nature had only been temporarily suppressed by shock and fear, grew to hate this order more with each passing day. He saw it not as salvation, but as a manifestation of their commander's cowardice and madness. In the darkness of the fighting compartment, in his inflamed mind, a rebellion began to fester. A rebellion against the jailer, against the god of this small personal hell. A rebellion that threatened to destroy their fragile empire from within. 20 days had passed. 20 endless cycles of heat and cold, thirst and hunger, hope and despair. The system Richter had built was working, but it was working at its limits. The men had changed beyond recognition. They had lost weight. Their movements had become slow, economical. They had almost stopped talking, communicating in short phrases or gestures. Each was immersed in his own inner world, in his memories and nightmares. But while the apathy of the others was passive, Kurt Vogel's was different. It was like a coiled spring, ready to snap at any moment. He followed orders, but hatred seeped from his every movement. He considered Richter a madman who fancied himself the captain of a submarine, dragging everyone down with him to the bottom. Rescue would not come. They had been written off long ago, buried. And he considered every day spent in this stinking tin can a betrayal of life itself. Better to die in battle trying to break out than this slow, humiliating decay while still alive. He began to act furtively. First, he tried to talk to Helmut. "Listen, Weiss, you're a smart guy. You must see that he's lost his mind. We've been sitting here for 3 weeks. No one is looking for us. We have to leave. At night, we have a chance." But Helmut, completely absorbed in his invention and calculations, just waved him off. His world had become volts, amps, and boiling points. The outside world had ceased to exist for him. Then Vogel turned to Fritz. "Fritz, you're an old soldier. You can see this is madness. He's killing us all. We have to do something." But Fritz Baumann just shook his head. "Discipline is all we have left, son. Without it, we'll turn into animals and tear each other's throats out in an hour. The commander knows what he's doing." Realizing he would find no allies, Vogel decided to act alone. His plan was simple and desperate. Wait until night when Richter was asleep, knock him unconscious, take his weapon, and by threatening the others, force them to abandon the tank and attempt a breakout. The climax came on the 22nd day. Richter had established a new rule. For the slightest breach of discipline, the punishment was the loss of a day's water ration. It was a harsh but necessary measure. And the first victim of this law was Vogel himself, who had fallen asleep on watch at the periscope. "You will go without water for 24 hours, Richter told him coldly in the morning. That was the last straw. "You!" Vogel screamed, leaping to his feet. His face was contorted with fury. "You're not a commander, you're a jailer, an executioner. You want to kill us all here in this pit?" "I'm trying to save your life, you idiot," Richter replied calmly, not raising his voice. "Save? You call this living?" Vogel jabbed a finger toward the rear where Emil's body lay. "We're rotting alive. And you're playing your stupid little games with your rules. I've had enough." He lunged at Richter. In the cramped space of the tank, a short, furious struggle ensued. They rolled on the filthy floor, exchanging muffled blows. Vogel was younger and stronger, but there was something inhuman in Richter, a kind of steely, cold rage. Helmut and Fritz rushed to separate them. At one point, Vogel managed to break free and grab a heavy wrench. He raised it to strike Richter, and then Fritz intervened. The old soldier, who until then had seemed half dead, moved with a speed unthinkable for his age. He didn't try to grab Vogel's arms. He did something no one expected. He simply stood between them, shielding his commander with his own body. "If you want to hit him, you'll have to hit me first," he said quietly. Vogel froze, the wrench held high. He looked into the old man's calm, tired eyes, and his fury began to subside, giving way to shame and despair. He dropped the wrench, which fell to the floor with a dull thud, and collapsed onto his seat, burying his face in his hands. He began to sob, quietly, soundlessly, his whole body shaking. The mutiny was crushed. Richter had defended his law and his authority. He looked at the broken Vogel, the frightened Helmut, and the impassive Fritz. He had won. But while they were fighting among themselves, while their small empire was enduring its first and most terrible crisis, they failed to notice that their true enemy, the one outside, had crept very close, and it was already preparing its final, devastating blow. The night of the 27th day was especially dark and quiet. There was no moon, and the distant cannonade, which had become the familiar backdrop to their existence, had for some reason fallen silent. This ringing silence pressed on the eardrums more heavily than any roar. The internal conflict was behind them. Kurt Vogel, broken and empty, had become a shadow of his former self. He carried out orders mechanically, but a void had permanently settled in his eyes. The crew, bonded by the crisis they had endured, sank into a state of lethargic waiting. They had suppressed the mutiny, but the victory had drained them of their last emotional strength. Richter himself was on watch at the commander's periscope. He no longer trusted anyone but himself. He stared through the eyepiece for hours, peering into the blurry, ghostly shapes of the night-shrouded ravine, and at some point he noticed movement. Vague, barely perceptible. Something stirred in the bushes on the slope, about 50 meters, roughly 160 feet, from the tank. Richter froze, his heart skipping a beat. He wiped the fogged glass and pressed his eye to the periscope again. Yes, it was no illusion. A dark figure flat against the ground was slowly crawling toward them, and behind it, another and another. A Soviet reconnaissance group. They had likely stumbled upon their tracks and decided to investigate the machine stuck in the ravine. 2 battle stations. Richter's whisper sounded like a thunderclap in the tank's silence. The sleeping men were instantly awake. Silently, like ghosts, they took their positions. Helmut switched on the emergency light. A dim bulb cast trembling shadows on their emaciated faces. Vogel, obeying instinct, pressed his face to the gun sight. Fritz stood frozen by the cannon's breech. Richter watched the scouts. There were 5 of them. They moved cautiously, professionally, using every fold in the terrain. Apparently they thought the tank was abandoned, knocked out, but they were still being careful. Adrenaline, which they hadn't felt for almost a month, flooded their veins, awakening dormant instincts. Thoughts raced through Richter's mind at a furious pace. What to do? Lie low and hope they pass by? But if they get too close, they'll discover the crew is alive. Then it's over. They'll toss grenades, set the tank on fire. Fire the cannon? 1 shot and they'd reveal their position to the entire front. A whole detachment with anti-tank guns would come for them next, not just a recon team. That left one option, the machine gun, the coaxial MG-34. It ran on battery power. Vogel, do you see the target? Richter whispered. I see it, came the gunner's muffled voice. 5 figures moving in a line. Fire only on my command. Aim for the lead man. Short bursts. Conserve ammunition. The minutes of waiting stretched into an eternity. The scouts got very close. One of them, apparently the leader, signaled for the others to halt and crawled forward himself. He reached the tank and cautiously tapped the armor with the barrel of his rifle. Inside the tank, the sound was like the tolling of a bell. Fire! Richter breathed. And hell broke loose. The deafening roar of the machine gun in the confined space nearly ruptured their eardrums. Spent casings clattered onto the floor. The air instantly filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Vogel, forgetting everything, clung to the grips and sprayed the darkness with lead. The first few bullets hit the slope of the ravine, but then he found his target. From outside came short cries and the dull thud of bodies hitting the ground. Return fire was not long in coming. Bullets began to drum against the armor. To the tiger, it was like mosquito bites to an elephant. But the sound inside was monstrous. It felt as if they were being struck by hundreds of hammers. At one point, a bullet, fired from almost point-blank range, hit the commander's triplex vision block directly. The armored glass held, but a thick web of cracks spread across it. Richter recoiled, blinded. The fight lasted no more than a minute. The surviving scouts retreated, carrying their wounded. And then silence fell again. A deaf-ringing silence. "Cease fire!" Richter yelled. The machine gun fell silent. They sat in complete silence, deafened, breathing heavily, inhaling the gunpowder smoke. "Everyone all right?" Richter asked. "I'm fine," Helmut answered. "Okay here," Vogel responded. There was no answer from Fritz. Richter shone his flashlight in his direction. The old soldier was sitting in his place, leaning against the ammunition rack. His eyes were open, staring into nothingness. In the middle of his chest, on his gray tunic, a dark, wet stain was spreading. A stray bullet, having ricocheted off an inner wall, had struck him directly in the heart. They had fought them off. They had won. But the price of this victory was terrible. They had lost their silent guardian angel. And what was worse, Richter. Their eyes and ears, their connection to the outside world was now blind. The shattered triplex was a murky, impenetrable blur. They had finally sealed themselves inside their own tomb. And it was at that exact moment, in the ensuing silence, that a new sound reached them. Distant, but distinct. The drone of engines. And it was not the sound of their own salvation. It was the sound of approaching retribution. The death of Fritz and the loss of visibility through the commander's periscope became the point of no return for the crew. It was the moment the armor cracked, when the last illusion of control over their situation shattered. Before they had been trapped, but they could see the world. Now they weren't just trapped. They were buried alive in a blind steel coffin. The drone of engines they had heard after the fight drew closer, then faded and died. Apparently, the surviving scouts had reported the situation, and armored support had been sent, but couldn't find them in the dark. But they knew. The search would resume at dawn, and then they would be found. The panic that Richter had suppressed for so long and so cruelly was ready to burst forth. Now there were 3 of them. 3 emaciated, half-dead men against the whole world. "They'll be back at dawn," Vogel rasped, his voice trembling. "They'll bring anti-tank guns and turn us into a sieve. We're finished." But Richter, instead of falling into despair, felt a strange, cold calm. The worst had already happened. They were at rock bottom, which meant there was nothing left to lose. And in his mind, a plan was born. A plan that was insane, suicidal, but the only one possible. "They will be looking for a tank," he said quietly, but so that everyone could hear. "They will not find a tank. They will find a hill. A muddy hill, overgrown with bushes." Helmut and Vogel stared at him, uncomprehending. "We must bury ourselves," Richter continued. "Camouflage the tank so that it's impossible to distinguish from the terrain. We must disappear." The idea was brilliant in its madness. They were in a marshy ravine full of mud, branches, grass. If they could cover the entire machine with a thick layer of camouflage, there was a chance they wouldn't be spotted even from close range. The most desperate work of their lives began. They cracked open the bottom escape hatch in the tank's floor. Through it, they began to pull in mud, grass, roots, everything they could reach. It was hellish labor. They worked in the dark, crawling on the floor, passing buckets of greasy, foul-smelling sludge to each other. Then one of them, tied with a rope, would climb out through the loader's hatch onto the roof and, lying flat on the armor, smear the mud over the surface, sticking branches and clumps of grass into it. It was a race against time. The sky in the east was already beginning to lighten. They worked like madmen, feeling no fatigue, driven by the fear of death. Just before dawn, they finished. The tank had vanished. In its place was a formless, ugly mound covered in mud and vegetation. They climbed inside, sealed the hatches, and fell silent. For the entire next day, they sat in complete darkness and silence, listening. And they heard them. First, the distant drone of engines, then guttural shouts. The Russians had returned. They heard a light tank, probably a T-70, clatter along the slope of the ravine. It passed 20 meters, about 65 feet away from them. They heard men walking very close, heard them talking, probing the mud with long rods. Every sound was a hammer blow to their hearts. At one point, one of the Russian soldiers climbed right onto their hill. They heard his heavy footsteps directly overhead, heard him say something to his comrades. It felt as if their hearts would leap out of their chests. But then he jumped off, and the voices began to fade. By evening, all was quiet. They had survived. They had cheated death. That day changed them completely. They stopped waiting for rescue. They realized there was no one to rescue them. The front had moved far ahead, leaving them deep in the enemy's rear. Their fortress had finally become their tomb, one in which they had buried themselves. Hope died. Only the animal instinct for survival remained. The days merged into one endless dark night, interrupted only by the ritual of distilling water and pathetic attempts to find food. They turned into troglodytes, cavemen living in the belly of a steel beast. Their calendar on their wall was their only connection to reality. 30 days, 35, 38. They buried Emil's body next to Fritz's in the rear. They no longer noticed the smell of decay. It had become part of their world. Their own sanity began to fray. They started seeing shadows, hearing voices. They imagined their dead comrades were talking to them. The line between reality and madness was blurring. And then, on the 40th day, when it seemed nothing more could happen, when they had almost become animals, they heard a sound. A new, unfamiliar sound. Not the drone of Soviet engines. Something different, familiar, from home. The muffled rumble of a German truck. August 21st, 1943. The 40th day of their confinement. They couldn't believe their ears. The engine noise they heard was faint at first, almost ghostly. They thought it was another auditory hallucination, a trick of their exhausted minds. But the sound didn't disappear. It grew louder, clearer, and it was the unmistakable sound of a German Opel Blitz truck engine. Richter, Vogel, and Helmut exchanged glances. In their sunken eyes, deadened by hunger and despair, A spark flickered. Not hope, no. Hope had died long ago. It was astonishment, bewilderment. How? What was a German truck doing here, deep in the Soviet rear? They heard the vehicle stop somewhere nearby, on the edge of the ravine. They heard German speech, cursing. Apparently some supply truck, separated from its convoy, had gotten lost. What should they do? Signal them? But how? Yell? No one would hear their hoarse, weakened voices. Fire a weapon? They had almost no machine gun ammunition left, and a single shot might frighten off their own men. And then Richter made a decision. He crawled to the signal pistol. There was a single flare left in it, a green one. He carefully cracked open the hatch, stuck his arm out, and fired into the sky. A green star soared over the ravine, momentarily illuminating the bleak landscape. From outside came shouts of surprise, then the command, "To arms!" They heard the click of rifle bolts. "Don't shoot! Friendlies!" Richter screamed with his last ounce of strength. He leaned out of the hatch, waving his arms. What the soldiers from the supply convoy saw left them in shock. From a muddy, overgrown hill they had mistaken for part of the terrain, a human head appeared, or rather a creature that vaguely resembled a human. Gaunt, bearded, with wild eyes and dressed in the tattered remains of a German tank uniform. And then two more emerged from beneath the earth, just as terrifying as the first. The soldiers stared at them, mouths agape. Rescue, when it finally came, was nothing like what they had dreamed of. There were no joyful embraces, no tears of happiness. There was only disbelief and revulsion in the eyes of their saviors. The three of them, three ghosts, were pulled from their steel grave. In the fresh air, they nearly lost consciousness. The world seemed unbearably bright, the sounds deafeningly loud. They were put in the back of the truck, given a canteen of water and a piece of bread. They attacked the food like wild animals, choking, unable to swallow. They were taken to the headquarters of the nearest unit, a retreating, battered infantry division, and here their second hell began, the hell of civilization. No one believed their story. 40 days, in an immobilized tank, survived on coolant water and mice? A counterintelligence officer, a well-groomed captain with tired, cynical eyes, listened to them with a wry smirk. 40 days, you say? He asked. And doesn't it seem to you, Herr Oberleutnant, that you simply sat out the fight in a ravine while your comrades were dying? That you showed cowardice and abandoned your machine? The machine is fine. The engine can be repaired, Richter tried to argue. We will recover your tank, the captain nodded, and we will conduct an investigation. In the meantime, you are at the disposal of a court-martial. It was a blow. A terrible, crushing blow. They had survived in inhuman conditions. They had conquered hunger, thirst, and madness. And now they were being accused of desertion. Their feat, their incredible story of survival, turned out to be an inconvenient truth that no one wanted to believe. It was easier to blame it on combat shock, on a lapse of reason, on cowardice. They were separated. Weeks of interrogations, confrontations, and examinations followed. The tank was indeed recovered. Inside, they found their ugly distiller, the calendar on the wall, the remains of mice, and the bodies of Emil and Fritz. The facts confirmed their story, but the system doesn't like facts that don't fit its narrative. The story was too incredible, too unheroic. Heroes were supposed to die in battle, not survive by eating worms. In the end, to avoid setting a precedent and blowing up a scandal, they decided to bury the case. There was no trial. But the verdict delivered by the system was the final, cruelest blow. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, stripped of his rank and awards, was sent as a private to a Strafbat, a penal battalion. Driver-mechanic Helmut Weiss, as a valuable specialist, was transferred to a repair company with a demotion in rank. Gunner Kurt Vogel was discharged due to complete psychological breakdown. Their brotherhood, forged in the hell of 40 days of captivity, was destroyed. Their fate was buried alive in dusty archive folders stamped secret. Fate scattered them, the three survivors of the steel tomb like autumn leaves. Their shared story was over, but each man's personal hell was just beginning. They had returned to the world of men, but they no longer belonged to it. 40 days spent on the edge between life and death had changed them forever, leaving an unhealing wound in their souls. Klaus Richter, former Oberleutnant, a proud Prussian, became a nameless, rankless penal soldier. He was sent to the very heart of the inferno, clearing minefields near Kiev. Those who served with him said he was a strange, silent man with dead eyes. He never spoke of his past. He worked without fear, without emotion, as if he had been dead for a long time. He did not fear death. Rather, he seemed to seek it. And he found it 2 months later, in the autumn of 43. He was blown up by an anti-tank mine. Almost nothing of him was left. The official report stated briefly, Private Richter, killed in the line of duty, atoned for his guilt with his blood. No one ever knew that this nameless penal soldier had once been the commander of an elite crew that had accomplished an incredible feat of survival. Helmut Weiss, the self-taught genius who had saved his comrades, turned out to be the luckiest. His knowledge and skills were valued, and he wasn't thrown onto the front lines. He served in a rear echelon repair unit for the rest of the war, bringing damaged tanks back to life. He worked obsessively, as if trying to drown his memories in the clang of metal and the smell of oil. He survived the war, returned to his destroyed Dresden, and became a watchmaker again like his father. He married, had children, but every night he had the same dream. The cramped, stuffy space of the tank, the taste of chemical water, and the silent shadows of his dead and living comrades. He never told anyone about those 40 days. His secret went with him to his grave in 1982. The most tragic fate was that of Kurt Vogel. The war didn't kill his body, but it destroyed his mind. He was discharged and sent to a psychiatric hospital for veterans. He suffered from a severe form of claustrophobia. He couldn't be in enclosed spaces, screamed in terror in elevators, and slept only outdoors, even in winter. He constantly spoke of mud sucking him down, of dead men living in the same room with him. The doctors diagnosed him with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, but no one knew its true cause. He lived a long but tormented life and died in complete solitude in the early 2000s at a ripe old age, taking his demons with him. Their graves are scattered across Europe. The grave of a hero, the grave of an ordinary citizen, the grave of a madman. And on no headstone is it written what united these three very different men, that they once stared into the abyss together and managed to climb out. They won their small, terrible war but lost in the clash with the large, indifferent world. Their bodies were buried on an old tank graveyard near Prokhorovka, in an unmarked grave, number 217. But as the old folks living in the nearby villages used to say, a strange ghost is sometimes seen in those parts. On misty nights, from a deep ravine, comes the muffled grinding of metal and quiet voices speaking in a foreign tongue. Who hears them, nobody knows. Official history has preserved no memory of the crew of the Tiger tank with tactical number 217. In the Wehrmacht archives, only a short dry entry remains. Missing in action during Operation Citadel. Period. The soulless war machine for which men were merely expendable material struck them from its lists, erasing the very memory of their existence. Their feat, their 40-day odyssey in a steel womb, their victory over death, turned out to be too inconvenient, too implausible, too human. War does not like such stories. War demands poster heroes, ready to die with the Führer's name on their lips, not survivors who debase themselves hunting mice and filtering poison just to live another day. The system buried their story in the deepest archive, hoping it would never see the light of day. But history has a strange quality. What the official chronicle forgets remains forever in the people's memory, in the trench truths, in the soldiers' tales whispered around a campfire. Their real story died with them, but in its place a legend was born. Among the German soldiers who fought on the Eastern Front, the tale of the ghost tiger of Prokhorovka circulated for a long time. It was said that somewhere in those marshes, a tank remained whose crew refused to surrender and could not die. That they still live in their machine, having become its spirit, its steel soul. They said that sometimes at night, they come out to hunt, avenging their forgotten lives. A similar story circulated among Soviet soldiers as well. Veterans who liberated those areas told it. The story of the Witch's Ravine, where even the bravest scouts were afraid to go. They said that something sat there in the mud, something that one night annihilated an entire reconnaissance platoon and then vanished, dissolved, as if it had never been. This story became a legend, a myth of human resilience pushed to its absolute limit, of how 5 men abandoned by all created their own world in hell and managed to survive in it. Was their struggle worth such sacrifices? Was it worth clinging to a life only to be betrayed and forgotten? There is no answer to that question. But their story is not just a chronicle of survival. It is a reminder that the most terrible thing in war is not death from an enemy's bullet, but the indifference of your own side. It is a tale of how even when your fortress becomes your prison, even when hope is dead and sanity is on the brink, something remains inside a man. Something that forces him to fight. Not for a Führer, not for a fatherland, not for lofty ideals, but simply for the right to take one more breath. And perhaps therein lies the tragic grandeur of the human spirit.